In our town, there was a sound we all knew, but nobody ever talked about. It was the sound of a leather whip cracking in the night, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the wind and settled in your bones like a chill. And it always came from Clara Harwell's cabin. Every evening her boy Garrett would walk through that door, and every evening the sounds would start. First, the shouting. Then the sickening crack of leather hitting wood or plaster or something softer, something that didn't make a sound at all, except for a choked gasp. The folks in town, they'd hear it. They'd shake their heads, maybe say a prayer, and then they'd shut their windows a little tighter. They told themselves it was family business. They told themselves Clara was a quiet woman who didn't want any trouble. They told themselves a lot of things to help them sleep at night. It wasn't always like this. Garrett used to be a good kid, they'd say. But he'd grown tall, and with that height came a shadow, a darkness in his eyes that looked like a storm brewing on a distant hill. He was stronger than his mother now, and angrier than anyone had a right to be. One time, old Mr. Tolles, who lived down the lane, had enough. He walked right up to the porch while Garrett was in the middle of a rage. He stood there, knuckles white on his cane, and shouted, "Son, you quiet that racket down!" Garrett didn't say a word. He just stopped, turned, and walked back inside the cabin. A moment later he came back out, that long leather whip in his hand. He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. He just let it drag on the wooden steps, slow and deliberate, like a serpent testing the air. Mr. Tolles went pale. He backed away, turned, and never looked back. After that, nobody tried to interfere again. The town decided, for its own peace of mind, that Clara Harwell was alone in her struggle. But they were wrong. Someone else was listening. Someone else was watching. On the southern ridge, far from the town's whispers and averted gazes, lived a rancher named Abraham Holt. He was a man carved from hardship, quiet and solitary. He'd lost his wife and young daughter to the winter sickness 2 years back, and a part of him seemed to have been buried with them under that frozen ground. He kept to himself, spoke only when necessary, and saw everything. He saw the way Clara flinched when the church bell rang too loud. He saw the faint, yellowing bruises on her arms when she bought flour at the general store, her hands trembling as she counted out the coins. He saw Garrett swaggering into the saloon, spending money he never earned on whiskey he didn't need. Abraham didn't believe in meddling. He believed in God, hard work, and minding his own business. But he also believed that some lines should never be crossed. And as the weeks turned into months, and the nightly sounds from Clara's cabin became a grim ritual, he felt something inside him shifting. A cold, hard anger he hadn't felt since the war. He started watching the cabin more closely. He'd ride the ridge at dusk, his horse silent on the pine needles, and just sit there in the fading light, listening. He heard the pleading in Clara's voice, the venom in Garrett's. He heard the whip, and each crack of that leather was like a nail being hammered into his own conscience. One night, the wind was particularly cruel, howling through the canyons like a lost soul. Abraham was in his barn, mending a harness, when the sound started earlier than usual. The shouting was louder, more desperate. Then came a crash, the sound of splintering wood, and then a scream. Not a gasp, but a full-throated scream of pure terror. It was a sound that broke something in Abraham. He dropped the harness, his face set like stone. He walked into his house, took the heavy rifle from above the mantelpiece, and checked the chamber. He didn't saddle his fastest horse. He saddled his strongest, the big gray that could pull a wagon out of a mud-swamped riverbed. He didn't ride toward the front of Clara's cabin. He rode around the back, through the tangled woods, following a game trail only he knew. He tethered his horse to a bent pine, the lantern in his hand casting long, dancing shadows. He wasn't the sheriff. He wasn't family. He was just a man who had seen enough. And as he walked toward the back door, the one nobody ever used, he knew this night would end one of two ways, with justice or with blood. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with fear. A chair was overturned, a plate of biscuits shattered against the far wall. Clara was on the floor, huddled against the sideboard, her hand pressed to her cheek where a fresh welt was already rising. Garrett stood over her, breathing hard, the whip coiled in his hand like a living thing. "Get up," he snarled. "I said, get up!" She didn't move. She just stared at the floorboards, her world shrunk to the splinters of wood and the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. She was praying, not for rescue, but for the strength to endure. And then it came. A knock, sharp and clear. Not on the front door, on the back. Garrett froze, his head snapping up. His eyes, wide with confusion and rage, darted toward the rear of the cabin. Nobody came to the back door. Ever. It was boarded over from the outside, or so he thought. Another knock, louder this time, insistent. It wasn't a request, it was a demand. "Who in the hell?" Garrett muttered. He stomped toward the door, unlatching the bolt that hadn't been turned in a decade. He yanked the door open, ready to unleash his fury on whatever fool was out there. And there stood Abraham Holt, lantern held high, face calm, eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. His shadow stretched long and ominous into the room. Garrett stared, momentarily stunned. "Holt, what do you want?" "Evening, Garrett," Abraham said, his voice even, without a trace of fear. "I heard a commotion. Figured I'd see if everything was all right." Garrett let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Everything's fine. This is my house, my mother. Now get off my property before I make you." He took a step forward, trying to use his size to intimidate, but Abraham didn't so much as blink. Abraham's gaze drifted past Garrett, to Clara, huddled on the floor. He saw the terror in her eyes, the fresh mark on her face. That was all he needed to see. The last shred of his restraint snapped. "You're not a man, Garrett," Abraham said, his voice dropping low. "You're a coward, raising your hand to the woman who gave you life." "She owes me!" Garrett screamed, his face contorting. "She owes me everything!" He raised the whip, not at Abraham, but as if to strike Clara again, to prove his point, to assert his dominance. He never got the chance. Abraham moved with a speed that defied his age and size. He lunged forward, not at Garrett, but at the whip. He caught the leather strap midair, his grip like iron. Garrett yanked back, but it was like trying to pull a root from the earth. Abraham didn't let go. He twisted his wrist, using Garrett's own momentum against him, and slammed the boy's hand into the doorframe. Garrett roared in pain and surprise, dropping the whip. He swung a clumsy fist at Abraham's head, but the older man ducked under it, stepped inside, and drove his shoulder hard into Garrett's chest. The boy stumbled backward, crashing over the overturned chair. He was strong, fueled by whiskey and rage, but Abraham was forged in a different fire. He was precise, efficient, and utterly relentless. He was on Garrett in an instant, pinning his arm behind his back, his knee pressed hard into the boy's spine. Garrett thrashed and cursed, but he was trapped. "You ever," Abraham said, his voice a harsh whisper right next to Garrett's ear, "you ever touch her again, and I will personally see to it that you never lift a hand for the rest of your miserable life. Do you understand me?" Garrett didn't answer. He just spat curses into the floorboards. Behind them, Clara had slowly, shakily gotten to her feet. Her eyes were wide, not with fear anymore, but with a dawning, terrifying realization. Someone was fighting for her. For the first time, someone was fighting back. And then she did something no one could have predicted. She walked forward, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She bent down and picked up the fallen whip. Garrett saw it, and a flicker of his old arrogance returned. He thought she was going to defend him, to plead for her boy. He was wrong. She held the whip with both hands, her knuckles white, and held it out. Not to him, to Abraham. Abraham let go of Garrett, who scrambled to his feet, clutching his bruised hand. He stared at his mother, at the whip in her hands being offered to this stranger, and his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You don't live here anymore, son," Abraham said, taking the whip from Clara. Get out." Garrett didn't speak. He just gave his mother one last venomous look, then turned and stormed out the front door, slamming it so hard the whole cabin shuddered. Silence fell, a profound, echoing silence that was louder than all the shouting and violence that had come before it. Clara stood frozen for a moment, the whip no longer in her hands, her arms limp at her sides. Then her strength gave out. Her knees buckled, but this time she didn't hit the floor. Abraham was there. He caught her, held her steady. For the first time in years, someone caught her. He gently led her to the old settee by the fire. She didn't speak, didn't cry. She just sat, staring into the flames. Abraham didn't press her. He quietly righted the chair, stoked the fire, and put a kettle on the stove. He sat in a chair across the room, the coiled whip resting on the table between them, a silent testament to the night's reckoning. Hours passed. The wind howled outside, but inside, a strange peace had begun to settle. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice a reedy whisper, like wind through dry leaves. He used to be such a good boy. He'd bring me wildflowers." Abraham just nodded, listening. "I don't know what happened," she continued, her eyes glossy with unshed tears. "I don't know where my son went." Abraham looked from her ravaged face to the whip on the table. He thought of his own loss, of the darkness that can swallow a person whole. "Sometimes," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed, "the people we love get lost on a road that doesn't lead back home." He paused, then looked directly at her. "But that wasn't your failing, Clara. None of this was." She finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a savior, but a man who understood sorrow. A man who knew what it was to stand in the wreckage of a life and wonder how to take the next breath. That night, Abraham didn't go home. He pulled his chair to the front door and sat watch, his rifle across his lap. He stayed awake until the first pale light of dawn crept over the hills. Garrett didn't come back, but Abraham knew this was far from over. He hadn't just driven a boy from his home. He had ignited a fuse, and the explosion was still to come. He had a sickening feeling in his gut that the whip was only the beginning. He had just uncovered the first layer of a rot that went much, much deeper than one broken family. The next morning, the town was buzzing. News traveled fast in a place that small, and the story of Abraham Holt facing down Garrett Harwell was on everyone's lips by the time the sun was fully up. Some called him a hero. Others called him a fool. The town mayor, a pompous man named Brody with a perpetually sour face, called him a problem. Brody rode his mule out to Abraham's ranch before noon. He didn't even bother to dismount. "Holt," he said, his voice laced with disapproval. "You can't just go walking into people's homes and laying hands on their kin. This town has laws." Abraham, who was mending a fence post, didn't stop his work. He just looked up at the mayor. "I'm aware of the law, Brody. I'm also aware that for the last year, a woman has been beaten in her own home, and the law has done nothing but look the other way." Brody shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Those are just whispers. She never filed a complaint." "And we both know why," Abraham said, driving a nail home with a single, powerful strike. "Fear isn't a good enough reason to let a man beat his mother to death." "It ain't your place," Brody insisted, his face turning red. Abraham finally stopped his work and turned to face the mayor fully. His eyes were hard. "Then whose place is it, Brody? Yours? You've known. You've all known. And you did nothing." He gestured toward the town in the distance. "Your silence was permission." Brody, flustered and angry, couldn't find a reply. He just muttered something about disturbing the peace and rode off in a huff. Abraham watched him go, a grim certainty settling in his stomach. The mayor wasn't just weak, he was afraid. But what was he afraid of? It was more than just Garrett. Abraham was starting to realize he'd stumbled into something much larger, a darkness that had its roots deep in the town's soil. He rode back to Clara's later that day, finding her sweeping the porch. She looked different. Her shoulders were straighter, the constant look of fear in her eyes replaced by a fragile, uncertain hope. But she was still afraid. "He'll be back," she said, her voice low. "He won't let this go." "I know," Abraham said, "but you won't be alone this time." Her gratitude was in her eyes, a silent, powerful thing. But as night fell, a new kind of dread settled over the small cabin. It was the fear of the unknown. Garrett was gone, but his presence lingered like a poison in the air. The attack came just after midnight, but it wasn't Garrett at the door. It was fire. The barn went up first. A whoosh of sound, then a roar as flames devoured the old dry timber. The blaze lit up the night sky, casting flickering demonic shadows across the yard. Abraham, who had been dozing in his chair on the porch, was on his feet in an instant, dragging a stunned Clara away from the house. "Stay back!" he yelled, grabbing buckets and throwing water on the flames, a futile effort against the inferno. It was no accident. The straw had been soaked in lamp oil. He could smell it. In the muddy ground near the barn, he saw a single set of footprints. Big boots, Garrett's size. But there was something else. A second set of prints, smaller, less distinct, leading away toward the woods. Garrett hadn't been alone. They fought the fire until dawn, but the barn was a total loss, a collapsed, smoldering skeleton against the rising sun. The sheriff finally arrived, looking tired and annoyed. He listened to Abraham's story, noted the footprints, and then shook his head. "Prints ain't proof, Holt," the sheriff said, scratching his beard. "I can't arrest a man on a hunch. And besides," he added, lowering his voice, "maybe you should have thought about the consequences before you went playing hero." Abraham stared at the sheriff, a cold fury building inside him. "Consequences? A woman was being terrorized. That's the only consequence that matters." "Look," the sheriff sighed, "I'll put the word out. Keep an eye out for Garrett. But my advice? Let this go. You stirred up a hornet's nest." As the sheriff rode away, Clara came to stand beside Abraham, looking at the ruin of her barn. Her face, for the first time, was not fearful. It was furious. "I gave him everything," she said, her voice hoarse. "Everything I had, and this is how he repays me." "This wasn't just him, Clara," Abraham said quietly, thinking of the second set of footprints. "He had help." Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw a new question forming. Who else wanted to hurt her? Why? The whip had been cruel, but this was something else. This was calculated. This was a message. And it wasn't just for her. It was for him, too. A warning to back off. That's when Abraham knew, with chilling certainty, that he couldn't let it go. He had to find Garrett. He had to find out who was pulling the strings. He had stumbled into a war he didn't understand, but he was damned if he was going to walk away now. He just had no idea that finding the truth would force him to confront a ghost from his own past, a tragedy he had spent years trying to forget. The person helping Garrett wasn't just a random accomplice. They were a key to a much darker secret, a secret that had already cost Abraham everything he'd ever loved. The silence that followed the fire was worse than the violence. It was a heavy, watchful quiet. Every rustle of leaves, every distant coyote call, sounded like a threat. Abraham stayed at the cabin, patching the fence, clearing the debris, his rifle never far from his side. He was protecting Clara, but he was also hunting. He was looking for a sign, a clue, anything that would lead him to Garrett and his mysterious partner. 3 days later, they found him. Or rather, he found them. Garrett stumbled down the main street of town at dusk, looking like he'd been through a war. His clothes were torn, his face was a mess of bruises and cuts, and he walked with a limp. He looked broken, but it was his eyes that chilled everyone who saw him. They were empty, hollowed out. All the fire was gone, replaced by a terrifying, dead calm. He didn't go to the saloon. He didn't go looking for a fight. He walked straight to the church, pushed open the doors, and sat down in the front pew, his head bowed. When word reached Clara, she went pale. "The church?" she whispered to Abraham. He hasn't set foot in a church since he was a boy. Maybe he's looking for forgiveness, Abraham offered, though he didn't believe it. No, she said, her maternal intuition sounding a silent alarm. It's a trap. Abraham saddled his horse. When he walked into the church, the air was cold. Pastor Warren was pacing nervously near the altar, while Garrett just sat there, motionless. Abraham's eyes immediately scanned the room, looking for the second man, but they were alone. Come to finish what you started, Holt? Garrett muttered without looking up. I came to see what new devilry you're planning, Abraham replied, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Garrett finally lifted his head, and a faint, cruel smirk touched his lips. I'm not planning anything. I just came to confess. Pastor Warren stopped pacing. Confess what, son? Everything, Garrett said, his voice suddenly loud and clear. He stood up, turning to face them both. I confess that I'm a monster, that I hurt my own mother, that I burned her barn to the ground. He took a step forward. And I confess that I wasn't alone. Abraham's hand instinctively went to the pistol at his hip. Who was with you, Garrett? Garrett laughed, a horrible, broken sound. You want to know? You really want to know who's been helping me? Who's been telling me what to do? He pointed a shaking finger, not at the door, but at the altar. Ask him. Ask God. He's the one who told me to do it, to punish her for her sins. Pastor Warren gasped, horrified. That's blasphemy. But Abraham saw the lie. It was a performance, a wild, desperate act designed to make him look insane, to make him look like a victim of religious delusion. It was clever, and it was terrifying. But why? Why go to such lengths? Your sins, Clara, Abraham said quietly. What sins is he talking about? Garrett's act faltered for a second. A flash of genuine fear crossed his face before he could mask it. She knows, he snarled. She knows what she did. What he did. He, her late husband. Before Abraham could process this, Garrett lunged, not at Abraham, but at the heavy brass cross on the altar. He ripped it from its stand, holding it like a club. The Lord wants a sacrifice, he screamed, his eyes wild. This was the trap. He wanted to be seen as a madman, to be taken away, locked up where no one could get to him. Because whatever he was truly involved in, a sanitarium was safer than the alternative. Abraham didn't pull his gun. He did something Garrett never expected. He turned his back on him and walked toward the church doors. I'm done with you, boy, he said, his voice full of disgust. You can play your games with the pastor. Your mother is safe now. That's all that matters. It was a gamble. He was betting that Garrett's true mission wasn't to be caught, but to terrorize Clara into doing something. By walking away, by showing that Clara was beyond his reach, he was rendering Garrett's mission a failure. It worked. Garrett's crazed act collapsed. He dropped the cross with a loud clang. Wait! He yelled, his voice raw with desperation. You don't understand! They'll kill me! Abraham stopped, his hand on the door. He turned back slowly. Who will kill you, Garrett? Garrett's face was ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but then his eyes darted to the stained glass window behind the altar. He saw something, or someone outside. The color drained from his face. Never mind, he whispered, his body trembling. It's too late. He turned and bolted, running out a side door and vanishing into the twilight. Abraham rushed to the window. In the distance, disappearing over a hill, was a single rider on a dark horse, a stranger. He rode back to Clara's with a knot of ice in his stomach. He told her what happened. The bizarre act, the mention of her late husband, the fear in Garrett's eyes, the mysterious rider. My husband? She whispered, her face a mask of confusion. Robert was a good man, a simple farmer. He had no enemies. Someone thinks he did, Abraham said grimly. And they're using Garrett to settle the score. The puzzle was getting bigger, the pieces sharper and more dangerous. It wasn't just about a bully and his mother anymore. It was about a dead man's secrets. It was about a son being used as a pawn in a game he couldn't comprehend. and it was about a mysterious group of people who had the power to make a boy like Garrett so terrified that he'd rather be branded a madman than speak their name. 2 nights later, the stranger on the dark horse paid them a visit. He didn't knock. He just appeared at the edge of the property as the sun bled out across the horizon. He was tall, dressed in black, with a scar that cut across his left cheek like a jagged bolt of lightning. He didn't introduce himself. He just sat on his horse and watched the cabin. Abraham stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in his hand. "You looking for someone?" Abraham called out. The man smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression that held no warmth. "I was," he said, his voice a low drawl. "But it seems my business has gotten complicated." His eyes flickered toward Abraham. "You're Holt, the rancher, the one who keeps sticking his nose where it doesn't belong." "And you are?" "A friend of Garrett's," the man said. "Let's just say he misplaced something that belongs to my employers. Something very valuable." Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Garrett hadn't just been a pawn, he'd been a courier, a thief. "He ain't here," Abraham said. "I know," the man replied. "But that's the thing about debts. They have a way of transferring to the next of kin." He tipped his hat, not to Abraham, but to the shadows in the doorway where Clara was standing. "Ma'am." It wasn't a greeting. It was a threat. This man, this scarred messenger, wasn't here for Garrett anymore. He was here for Clara, and the valuable thing Garrett had lost. Abraham had a sickening feeling it wasn't gold or silver. It was something far more dangerous. It was information. And it was a secret that was about to bring a whole world of pain down on their heads. The man's name was Rusk. He didn't offer it, Abraham found out later from a nervous stable hand in town who'd recognized the horse's brand. The brand belonged to a syndicate, a shadowy organization known only as the Committee. They weren't lawmen or outlaws. They were something in between. Businessmen who dealt in land, secrets, and fear. They bought up failing ranches, manipulated water rights, and made people disappear. And Rusk was their collector. "My employers are patient people," Rusk said from horseback, his voice carrying on the cold night air. "But their patience has a price. Garrett was supposed to deliver a package, a simple task. He failed. Now the debt falls to his mother." Clara stepped out from the shadows of the porch, her face pale but resolute. "I have no money. This ranch is all I have." Rusk's cold smile returned. "Oh, we're not interested in your money, ma'am. We're interested in this land. Your late husband, Robert, made a deal with us years ago, a loan to save this place from foreclosure. He offered the deed as collateral." Clara staggered back as if struck. "No, he would have told me." "Men do a lot of things they don't tell their wives about," Rusk said coolly. "He was supposed to pay us back with a share of his profits. He didn't. He died. The debt remained. Garrett, foolishly, thought he could clear his father's name by working for us. Instead, he just dug the hole deeper." He paused, letting the words sink in. "He lost a ledger, a book containing names, accounts, debts, our entire operation in this territory. We want it back, and we believe he hid it here." The pieces fell into place with a horrifying crash. The abuse, it hadn't just been cruelty. It had been a tactic. Garrett, under orders from the committee, had been trying to break his own mother's spirit, to terrorize her into abandoning the ranch so they could take it without a fight. The barn fire was an escalation. The scene at the church was a desperate attempt to get himself locked away from their wrath when he lost the ledger. He wasn't just a monster. He was a puppet whose strings had been cut. And now the puppet masters were here to burn down the entire stage. "We don't have your book," Abraham said, his grip tightening on his rifle. "Then I suggest you find it," Rusk said. He reached into his coat and tossed a small, heavy object onto the ground. It was a pocket watch, old and silver. "That belonged to your husband, ma'am. A token of our previous arrangement. Consider it a reminder." He turned his horse. "You have until the next full moon. Find the ledger, or we'll come back to collect the deed. and we won't be asking nicely." He rode off, leaving the silver watch glinting in the moonlight like a single cold tear. Clara picked it up, her hands shaking. It was Robert's. She remembered the day he bought it. He'd been so proud. Now it felt like a shackle. They had to find Garrett. He was the only one who knew where the ledger was hidden. They also knew that the committee would be hunting him too. It was a race. The search was a descent into a hell they couldn't have imagined. They followed a trail of Garrett's fear and desperation, from one dusty town to the next. They found him in a squalid boarding house, passed out from whiskey and exhaustion. When he saw his mother, he didn't show anger or defiance. He just wept. Huge, shuddering sobs of a boy completely and utterly broken. "I tried to get away," he choked out, his story tumbling out between gasps. "They made me hurt you. They said they'd do worse if I didn't. They said they owned us because of Pa's debt. When I lost the ledger, I knew they'd kill me. I knew they'd come for you." He had hidden it. In a moment of panic, when Rusk's men were closing in, he had stuffed the leather-bound book into the saddlebag of a passing mail courier heading east. It was a wild, desperate gamble. There was no time to lose. Abraham and Clara rode east, pushing their horses to the limit. They caught up to the mail rider 2 days later, a grizzled old man who was surprised to see them but handed over the saddlebag without question. Inside, nestled between letters and parcels, was the ledger. It was heavier than it looked. Abraham opened it, his blood running cold as he saw the columns of names, dates, and debts. It was a blueprint of the committee's reign of terror. He saw the names of ranchers who had mysteriously lost their land. He saw records of payments made in cash, livestock, and other things. Things described in chillingly vague terms like services rendered and silence procured. Then he saw it. At the bottom of a page, a familiar name, Robert Harwell, and the debt marked in red ink, paid in full. But the date of payment was a week after Robert had died. Clara looked at it, her brow furrowed. How is that possible? How could he pay them after he was dead? Abraham felt a surge of ice water in his veins. He flipped back a few pages, his eyes scanning the lists, a wild, impossible suspicion taking root in his mind. He was looking for another name. A name he hadn't spoken in 2 years. The name of his wife. And then he found it. Eleanor Holt. Beside her name, it didn't list a debt. It listed a payment to the committee. And the service rendered? Information on Robert Harwell's assets, the world tilted on its axis. Abraham staggered back, the ledger falling from his hands. Clara rushed to his side, but he couldn't speak. He could only stare at the name, the lie he had lived for 2 years, shattering around him. His wife, his Eleanor. She hadn't been a victim of the committee. She had been working for them. She had sold out her neighbor, Robert Harwell. And the payment for her betrayal, he now realized with sickening certainty, must have been Robert's life. The committee hadn't waited for him to default. They had murdered him to seize his assets, using the information Eleanor had provided. And the winter sickness that took his wife and child? It wasn't a sickness. That had been a lie, a story the committee had let him believe. They had killed his family. To silence his wife, the one person outside their circle who knew the truth about Robert Harwell's death. They had tied up their loose ends. His quest to save Clara hadn't been a random act of decency. Fate, or something darker, had led him right back to the men who had destroyed his life. This was never just her fight. It had been his all along. And the ledger in his hands wasn't just evidence. It was a death warrant. For them, or for him. The ride back was a blur of dust and grief. Abraham was a ghost, a hollowed-out man wrestling with a betrayal so profound it poisoned every memory he had. His wife, the woman he had mourned, had been a monster. His quest for justice for Clara had become a quest for vengeance for himself. The lines had blurred, and all that was left was a cold, hard resolve. He didn't tell Clara. Not yet. The truth was too raw, too dangerous. He just told her that the ledger proved her husband had been murdered. That was enough to ignite the same steel in her eyes that was now in his. Garrett, left in the care of a trusted doctor in a distant town, was out of the picture. This was between them and the committee now. When they arrived back at the ranch, Rusk was waiting for them. Not on his horse this time, but sitting on the porch steps, as if he'd been expecting them. "You found it," he said. It wasn't a question. Abraham walked right up to him and pressed the barrel of his rifle under Rusk's chin. "Your employers murdered my family," he said, his voice a low, deadly snarl. Rusk didn't flinch. He just looked up with tired, weary eyes. "I know," he said quietly. "I was there." The confession hung in the air, more shocking than a gunshot. "I was young," Rusk continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "Eager to prove myself. They told me it was just business, tying up a loose end. Your wife, she knew too much. She got greedy. They sent me and another man. We made it look like the sickness." He finally met Abraham's eyes, and for the first time, Abraham saw not a killer, but a man haunted by his own demons. "I never forgot the look on your face when you found them. I've seen it in my sleep every night for 2 years. Abraham's finger tightened on the trigger. His entire being screamed for him to end it, to take his revenge right here, right now. "If you kill me," Rusk said calmly, "another man will take my place. A man without a conscience. A man who won't hesitate. They know you have the ledger. They'll be coming. Not just one of them. All of them." He paused. "But I can give you a chance." Clara stepped forward. "A chance? Why would you help us?" "Because of him," Rusk said, nodding toward Abraham. "Because I owe him a debt that can't be paid in silver. And because I'm tired of working for devils." He looked from Abraham's face to Clara's. "The committee has a weakness. They're arrogant. They believe everyone is scared of them. They believe no one will fight back. We need to prove them wrong." His plan was simple and insane. He proposed they leak pages of the ledger to the other ranchers, the ones whose names were in the book, the ones who had been extorted and threatened for years. Show them they weren't alone. And then they would make their stand here, at this ranch. They would fortify it and wait for the committee to come to them. They would turn Clara's home into a fortress. It was a suicide mission, but it was their only hope. Abraham, his heart a storm of hatred and grief, slowly lowered his rifle. Vengeance against one man was empty, but justice against an entire syndicate, that was a cause worth dying for. For the next 3 days they worked. They sent Garrett, now a shell of a man racked with guilt, away with a trusted friend to the far territories. Then, under the cover of darkness, Abraham and Clara rode to the neighboring ranches, slipping torn pages from the ledger under doorways. They didn't know if anyone would answer the call. They boarded up windows, dug trenches, and stockpiled ammunition. Rusk, using his insider knowledge, showed them how the committee would likely attack, a pincer movement, coming from the woods and the main road simultaneously. He was no longer their enemy. He was their general, a broken, damned man seeking one final act of redemption. On the night of the full moon, the air grew still. The world seemed to hold its breath. From their vantage point in the hayloft of the rebuilt barn, they saw them coming. A dozen riders moving like wraiths through the moon-drenched fields. The committee had arrived to collect their debt in blood. Abraham chambered around. Clara, her face grim, cocked the shotgun in her hands. Rusk stood between them, a pistol in each hand, his scarred face illuminated by the moonlight. He looked almost at peace. "They'll send 2 men to the house first, to try and get you, Clara," he said. "The rest will wait for the signal. Don't fire until they're on the porch." The 2 men broke from the group, creeping toward the house. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The men reached the steps. One of them kicked open the door. Now, Rusk whispered. The night exploded. 3 shots, fired as one, echoed across the valley. The 2 men on the porch fell. The main group of riders, startled, spurred their horses forward, charging the ranch head-on. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets tore through the walls of the barn, splintering wood. Abraham, Clara, and Rusk fired back. A desperate 3-person army against a dozen trained killers. But they weren't fighting alone for long. From the east ridge, a muzzle flash. Then another. From the south, more gunfire. The other ranchers, the ones who had received the pages from the ledger, had come. They had seen the truth, and they had chosen a side. They emerged from the darkness, a citizens' army rising up against the tyranny that had plagued them for years. The committee, caught in a crossfire, fell into chaos. Their arrogance had been their downfall. They had never expected resistance. Rusk laughed, a wild, triumphant sound as he fired into the fray. But in the chaos, one of the committee's men, a brutal killer known as Gresham, broke through the line and charged the barn. He leapt from his horse, a massive knife in his hand, his eyes locked on Abraham. Rusk saw him coming. He pushed Abraham out of the way, just as Gresham lunged. The knife, meant for Abraham, plunged deep into Rusk's side. Rusk grunted, staggering back, but he brought his pistol up and fired point-blank into Gresham's chest. Both men fell to the ground. Abraham rushed to Rusk's side. The collector was fading fast, a bloody smile on his lips. "Tell them," he coughed, blood flecking his lips. "Tell them the debt is paid." His eyes went vacant. The battle raged on, but the tide had turned. The committee, outmaneuvered and outnumbered, broke and fled, leaving their dead and wounded behind. By dawn, the silence had returned, broken only by the whimpering of injured men and the smell of gunpowder. The ranch was saved. The committee was broken. Abraham stood over the body of the man who had helped murder his family, a man who had also just saved his life. He felt no triumph, only a vast, aching emptiness. He had his vengeance, but the ghosts remained. Clara came and stood beside him, her face streaked with grime and tears. She looked at the carnage, at the bodies of the men who had terrorized her family, and then at the ranchers who were tending to their own. She looked at Abraham, the man who had lost everything, and who had just helped her win it all back. "It's over," she whispered. Abraham looked at the rising sun, a new day dawning on a changed world. "No," he said quietly, "it's just beginning." He knew that the fight wasn't just about bullets and ledgers. The real fight was what came next. It was about rebuilding, not just a barn, but a community. It was about turning a place of fear and secrets into a place of hope. And for the first time in 2 years, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever. Not peace, but purpose. In the years that followed, the story of that night became a legend, whispered in hushed tones around campfires and in taverns. The story of how the quiet people of the valley rose up. The story of the committee's fall. But the real story, the one that mattered, happened quietly on the Harwell Ranch. They buried Rusk on the hill, under the old oak tree, with no name on his cross, just the respect of the 2 people who knew his final truth. The ranch changed. It was no longer just a home, it became a sanctuary. Clara, with Abraham by her side, started taking in the valley's forgotten children, the ones left behind by the chaos the committee had sown. Orphans, runaways, children from broken homes filled with the same violence she had once endured. Her home, once a prison of fear, became a beacon of hope. The sounds of whips and shouting were replaced by the laughter of children and the quiet hum of lessons being taught in the shade of the rebuilt barn. Abraham, the grim-faced avenger, became a grandfather figure, his hands, once skilled with a rifle, now gentle as they mended toys and taught boys how to carve wood. He never spoke of his wife again. He had buried his grief and his vengeance on that bloody night. He found his peace not in forgetting, but in building something new from the ashes of the old. One day, a circuit judge, a man tied to the old, corrupt powers, came to the ranch. He carried a court order, accusing Clara of running an unlicensed orphanage, of harboring fugitives, of being an unfit guardian. He intended to shut her down, to scatter the children, to erase the defiant hope she had built. Clara met him on the porch. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood Abraham, and behind them, nearly 24 children, from toddlers to teenagers, all of them silent, watching. And on the ridges surrounding the ranch, the ranchers who had fought with them that night began to appear, one by one, their presence a silent, unmovable wall of support. The judge looked at the sea of determined faces, at the unyielding strength in Clara's eyes, and he saw what the committee had failed to see. He saw a people who would not be broken. He crumpled the court order in his fist, turned without a word, and rode away. Clara Harwell lived a long life. She never saw Garrett again, but she prayed for his soul every night. She turned a legacy of debt and violence into a legacy of love and refuge. She proved that the deepest wounds can heal, and that out of the greatest darkness can come the most brilliant light. She showed an entire valley that you don't fight evil by becoming it. You fight it by building something so good, so strong, that the darkness has no place to take root. Her story is a reminder that courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about looking fear in the eye and saying, "You do not own me." It's about standing up when the world tells you to stay down. If you were moved by the story of Clara and Abraham's incredible fight for justice, and you believe in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories of forgotten heroes. Because true strength isn't found in the crack of a whip, but in the hand that reaches out to help in the dark.